There are thousands of wine glass designs out there in the world. But as a wine taster, I'm not that interested in whether or not a wine glass is pretty. What I'm interested in is how well a glass does its job of helping me taste accurately and objectively. You'll actually find out that the most functional wine glass ends up being the most good-looking wine glass as well. In this great big world of ours, there is a single glass that fulfills the job description of a tasting glass to perfection. This, the ISO tasting glass. This is the universal tasting glass according to the International Standards Organization. It is quite small compared to your normal wine glass. If you fill it up to the brim, it holds about 21.5 centiliters of liquid. However, you're not going to fill it up to the brim. You just need to pour wine to the widest point of the glass, so that you maximize surface contact between the wine and air. If you pour the wine correctly, this glass will hold about 50 ml of liquid, which should be enough wine for a taster to write a comprehensive tasting note. The reason why this one glass is the international standard wine tasting glass is because it fits 4 criteria that help you, as a wine taster, taste wine properly. It's not just the ISO tasting glass, but all still wine glasses ever should fulfill these 4 criteria. Take any good quality still wine glass and you'll find these 4 elements embedded into its design. First of all, the ISO wine glass has a rounded bowl. This enables you to swirl your wine. You swirl your wine in order to increase the amount of oxygen that your wine gets, and the more oxygen it gets, the more aroma molecules will be released from the wine. The more molecules are released, the easier it is for a taster to correctly identify the aromas. Now we get to the second criteria. The walls of a wine glass should lean inward, and this is for 2 practical reasons. Firstly, it's so that when you swirl your wine, the walls converging inwards will prevent your wine from spilling. But that's just common sense. If you're gonna swirl your wine, you can't swirl it in a martini glass. It has to be a glass like this, where the walls are sort of slanted inward. Also, very importantly, when you're writing a proper tasting note and you're analyzing the appearance of a wine in a glass, you have to sort of tilt your wine glass at an angle very close to 90 degrees and look at it from above. You have to look at the wine in such a way so that it forms this oval shape, almost like a tulip. With an ISO glass, you'll be able to do just this. You'll be able to tilt it very close to 90 degrees without spilling the wine, and that's thanks to its inwardly slanting walls. So hopefully now it's starting to become apparent that a proper tasting glass or a proper wine glass has functions. It must be practical. It's not about what it looks like, it's about its function. Criteria number 3, and I shouldn't even have to say this because it's fairly obvious, but still, all wine glasses and tasting glasses should be made out of transparent glass. When you're tasting wine, you need to be able to clearly assess its appearance. You need to be able to clearly see the wine. Any distraction on the glass will prevent you from doing that and therefore not be a good tasting glass. So the glass itself needs to be transparent and as simple as possible. However, when you go to a wine school or a professional tasting or even to a winery, they do put these logos on the glass. Most of them try to make the logos fairly inoffensive, and typically these logos don't detract from your experience of actually tasting the wine. Also, you can't really blame them. They have to do a bit of marketing, so fair enough. But things like this, where the glass is fully opaque, that's a no-no. Last but not least, criteria number 4. A tasting glass or a wine glass needs to have a stem. And sure, maybe we all think that a stemmed glass always looks much better than a glass without a stem. However, the stem is there first and foremost for practical reasons. Every wine has a specific serving temperature at which it should be poured into the glass. When you're holding a glass by the bowl, you are transferring your body heat from your hand to the wine in the glass, thus warming the wine. Typically, we don't want to warm the wine in our glass. That's why we hold the glass by the stem. The exception to the rule here is if someone has served you your wine a bit too cold, too chilly, then you might hold the bowl in your hands and swirl it around, trying to warm it. However, typically, If you're in a restaurant or in a formal setting, the wine will be served to you at the correct temperature. That is why we hold glasses by the stem, to prevent heat transfer between our bodies and the wine in the glass. Every single wine person or wine connoisseur knows this. This is actually a personal pet peeve of mine. When I'm watching a film or a TV series and the characters are all meant to be these old money people and their butler brings them a glass of, really fancy wine, and they even mention the name of the wine, like Mouton 62 or something, and then they pick up the glass by the bowl. Oh, that just ruins the magic for me. I can't suspend my disbelief. You're meant to be playing this sophisticated character and you're holding your wine glass by the bowl. And then I spiral and my train of thought is, maybe the director wanted us to notice this. And maybe that's the director's way of telling us, the viewer, that this character is a fraud and they're not who they're claiming to be at all because they're holding their wine glass incorrectly. But in any case, people, hold your wine glasses by the stem, or else I will find you and I will narrow my eyes at you disapprovingly. So we've talked about the tasting glass, but obviously most people don't enjoy their wine in a professional tasting environment. They enjoy their wine at home or in a restaurant for pleasure. Non-tasting glasses for still wine still need to fulfill these 4 criteria that we've just talked about. The only difference between the ISO tasting glass and a normal still wine glass is usually size. That's because if you're drinking for pleasure, you'll need more than the 50 milliliters of wine that a tasting glass can hold. There's still one thing to cover here, and that's the difference between red wine glasses and white wine glasses. So this is where opinions differ. If you've got the budget to buy a variety of wine glasses, or if you're in a restaurant, a red wine glass will be slightly larger than a white wine glass, or in other words, the white wine glass will be slightly narrower. And that's because white wine doesn't typically need as much contact with oxygen to open up as red wine does. So it makes sense that white wine glasses would be a bit narrower or a bit smaller. Just to exemplify what I said a second ago, this is my red wine glass, this is my white wine glass. But because I really like the swirling sensation with this big red wine glass, I'll sometimes have my white wine in a red wine glass. Truth is, both of these glasses fulfill those 4 criteria, so whichever one you choose to use, you'll be okay. You can take it a step further and say that it's not enough to just have one design of red wine glass. You can have a red wine glass for Pinot Noir, a red wine glass for Merlot, a red wine glass for Cabernet Sauvignon. Don't get me wrong, I would love to have the budget and the space in my cupboards for such a luxury. But in truth, I don't think it matters that much objectively. But if it enhances your wine drinking experience, go for it. But no glass will hinder your tasting ability as long as it conforms to those 4 criteria that we've just discussed. Sparkling wine. Okay, so things change a bit for sparkling wine. Sparkling wine, by definition, has bubbles in it, which agitate the wine, which means that there's no need for you to really swirl the wine before smelling it and tasting it. If there's no need for swirling, then you don't need that big rounded bowl like for still wines. So the main practical function of a sparkling glass is to emphasize the bubbles. For sparkling wine, you want glasses that are long and tall, so that each bubble traverses a long distance before it pops to the surface and disappears. In tasting, you would use a normal ISO glass for sparkling wine, but in a casual environment, you would use a nice champagne glass. Which brings me to champagne coupes, if that's how you pronounce it. Coupe? Whilst they look nice, champagne coupes completely miss the point of what champagne is for, because contact surface with air is way too large. So as soon as you pour champagne into these glasses, the bubbles will simply immediately rise to the surface and disappear. You'll end up with flat wine before you can blink. Champagne coupes are a great way of quickly making still wine out of sparkling wine. Use them for cocktails, use them for something else, don't use them for champagne. A lot of work goes into making those bubbles in champagne, and there's a lot of tradition behind it, so seeing the bubbles wasted immediately as you pour the champagne into the glass just breaks my heart a bit. Last but not least, we'll talk about fortified wines and dessert wines. What kind of glass should you use to serve fortified and dessert wines? The 4 criteria still apply, so you can basically use any still wine glass, or a still wine glass, but that's just a bit smaller. My favorite wine glass for fortified or dessert wines is, of course, the ISO glass. These wines are typically sold in smaller bottles than normal still wine, and typically your guests won't want to drink as much fortified or dessert wine as they have drunk still wine, so a smaller glass is appropriate. I'm Teddy, this has been my wine channel, and make sure you drink elegantly.